Well, we have these new standards, there's eight of them, that we will be dealing with come next year. There's some really good reasons why they wanted to change these standards. Primarily, the old ones weren't working. Okay. So, the party line around why these standards are changing is they want to reduce unnecessary regulatory burden, and the reality is that comes around the way they're implemented, not through the standards themselves. So what they in fact want is to implement a risk-based model. So the idea is that RTOs who are higher risk, based on a set of risk indicators, will be the target of the regulation. Those RTOs that consistently demonstrate compliance and good practice will see less of the regulator, to the point where we've already started to see some of that coming into play with this idea of earned autonomy. And around 500, it was around 500 RTOs with ASQA, of the 4,000 odd that they regulate, being offered the opportunity to in fact manage their scope regulation themselves. So some RTOs have taken that up, others have decided it's not such a great idea, and others have decided to think about it for the 12 months that they have to decide whether they want to participate in that or not. So this reducing regulatory burden is really about the risk-based approach that is going to be put into play. The other thing that they wanted was they wanted really clear standards that were relevant to RTOs and that providers and regulators could have a consistent interpretation of them. So when we have outcomes-based standards and they say to us what we have to achieve, not how we have to achieve something, then it's really, really important for those what statements to be clear. And I think you could probably argue quite effectively that the what statements that we had in our previous standards were broad enough that to interpret them consistently was in fact quite a challenge for everybody. So when you have a look at these standards and you look at the concepts that are in these standards, the concepts in these standards are no different to the concepts that were in the last standards. However, the description that sits around, or the specification that sits in them, is greatly increased. So our detail around the what statements has changed substantially. And the other reason why they made this change was they really wanted learners and employers to have some confidence in the integrity of our system. You know, I'm sure that many of you have dealt with or heard of RTOs that in fact don't do a great job. They're in fact here to make a whole lot of money and not much else. And you know, regulation is seen as one way of trying to stop that happening, and we needed a set of standards that could do that so that the receivers of our product, the people that we qualify, could in fact have confidence both locally, nationally and internationally, that when you send someone here and they get a diploma, then that's what they're really getting. That they're not getting some dodgy out of a Wheaties packet qualification. So there's a whole lot of very, very good reasons for these standards to change, and this is what we have ended up with. Turns out tail's quite inconvenient. So we have now 8 standards, and within those standards there are a number of clauses. So in the same way that our old standards had standard 1.1, 1.2, that's what they're calling the clauses here. So standard 1, which is about the training and assessment, in fact has a whole lot of clauses in it. It is a whopper of a standard, and you know, for trainers and assessors it will be the one in fact that you spend the majority of your time with. There's a lot of information in those standards, and both of the regulators are putting out users guides. So can I borrow yours, Eva? Thank you. So ASQA has already released their users guide. You can access it from their website in either electronic, or you can download a print version of that. And the Training Accreditation Council is also going to put out a users guide, and we might ask why they're putting out a different users guide. And there's a really good answer to it. Would you like to hear it? Yes. Okay. Now let's hope I can remember it. The reason that TAC is putting out a separate user's guide is that when you have a look at the ASQUIS user's guide, what they have done is they've addressed the standards and they've added some things on top of the standards. Now, it has always been TAC's approach not to do that. So while they're using that user's guide as the basis for it, anywhere where ASQUA has put their own, we want you to do this, that is not going to be in TAC's user's guide. So TAC's user's guide will deal only with the standards and not with the additional ASQUA requirements that have been placed on top of the standards. Okay. So obviously we have a short period of time and we can't go into the detail of all of those standards. So what I've tried to do is pick out those things that are really major changes for us to have a talk about. Okay, so these are the, oh, that colour doesn't show up very well. These are the things that are the major changes. So the first thing I want to deal with, I guess, is the detail and specification. These standards are far, far more detailed than the previous set of standards, and they're in particular areas where the regulators, and in particular ASQUA, have had a lot of information around what they consider to be problems. That is where you see the detail and specification. So for example, you see it in training and assessment, you see it in complaints handling, you see it in marketing. That is where the detail is. And they have been extremely specific in some areas to the point of, in fact, telling you exactly what you need to do. And let me just give you a couple of examples of that. So in our previous standards, we would have, I'm sure you will all remember, the statement that you have to systematically validate your assessment. That's all the standard said. Systematically validate your assessment. Now when we look at validation, there is in fact a number of clauses that deal with it. So it talks about you having to implement a plan for validation, and that plan has to include when the assessment is going to occur, which training products are going to be the focus of the validation, who is going to lead and participate in the activities, and how the outcomes of the activities will be documented and acted upon. Excuse me. So when you are thinking about your validation process, they've put a whole lot of information in there that says, when you're planning this, you must include this information or take this into consideration. The next clause tells you how much of your training product you have to validate. It gives very specific numbers. At least 50% of your products have to be validated in the first 3 years, and your whole offering within a 5-year period, which just happens to be your period of registration. And then there's another clause which actually says who can be involved in it. So we've gone from one line, systematically validate, to in essence 3 little parts of the standard that in fact tell you how you're going to do it, who's going to be involved in it, and how much of it you have to do. So that's the kind of change that we're talking about when we talk about that there's a lot more detail and specification in these standards. There's very much a focus on the RTO's practice. So whenever it talks about what you're doing, it'll talk about your strategies and practice, the materials and practice. So it's not enough to have a piece of paper. So in the audit process, we'll be looking about how you operate, what you're doing, and whether your practice actually meets the requirements of the standards. So that focus on practice, in my opinion, is in fact a very good thing. It's a very, very good thing. And it means that when you have a look at your systems, you're going to have to make sure that you have data that is going to enable you to evaluate whether your practice is effective. And there's going to be a lot of RTOs that will be quite challenging for them to do that. That will mean some quite big changes. There's obviously a lot of information in there. There's a standard that is about the USI, the Unique Student Identifier, and the implementation of the USI and a VETMIS. Now we've known that's coming for a long time, and in fact it has a life of its own. It's something we haven't had to deal with before, but we will be dealing with in the future. Another big change is the information that sits around the TAE qualification. So the TAE qualification is being are treated separately to every other qualification that we deliver in the vet sector. And there's an extremely good reason for that too. That qualification underpins our ability, all of us as trainers and assessors, to actually work in that sector. We also know that it's one of the most compromised qualifications that's delivered in our sector. So there has been some action taken to try and address that. So we've started to specify who can deliver it and what kinds of qualifications those people have to have. And again, there's a scale, so there's a transition period between where we are today and what's going to happen in 2017, where we move to everybody who's going to deliver that qualification needing to hold one of the specified diplomas that sits in the schedules. And of course, there's also the requirement in there for independent validation. Now, just how that independent validation is going to work, again, is something that we don't have a lot of information about yet, but we've got a year to figure out how we're going to do it, because that starts in 2016. So the treatment of the TAE has been quite separate to every other qualification. In fact, there's about 4 or 5 clauses that are about that qualification. There's a whole lot of information in these standards that are about protecting the learner. So there's a lot of specification around complaints and appeals processes, and there's a lot of specification around what kind of marketing information has to be provided to the learner. Now, this is a particular focus from ASQA and from their data collection around those things that they feel compromise the outcomes of VT. So the feeling is, if you tell people up front enough about what they're going to receive, then in fact the training and assessment, or the quality of the training assessment should follow. Whether that works or not is something I guess we'll find out in a few years. So there is a lot of information in there around what you have to provide to the learners and when you have to provide it. In fact, there is an entire standard that sits around that. There's also a lot of information in there about partnerships and brokerage. So when you see statements in there around, let's say it's providing information to learners, it's you or someone else who does it on your behalf. So again, there has been, and you would have seen it in the news, a lot of focus on third-party people being involved in training and assessment, and these standards are looking at trying to address that. So we're making sure, in essence, what the standards do is whatever applies to you as an RTO also applies to any third party that might be involved in your training and assessment. So a huge focus on making sure that those people, in fact, do the right thing by the learners when they're acting on your behalf, and they are acting on your behalf. And the standards go to the point where there actually has to be a formal written agreement between you and whoever those third parties are to provide. And the best bit, training's in there. Yes. So finally, we have a little bit of focus. It's not a big focus, but we do have a little bit of a focus on teaching and learning in these standards. And it's really aimed at a couple of things. So firstly, you know, we all know we have a problem with short duration courses in the sector. So what this set of standards has done is they've said, you have to look at your learner group and you have to figure out how much training that learner group needs. And when you figure out how much training that learner group needs, you have to do it based on a few different things, one of which is the existing knowledge and skill of that learner. So if you have a novice coming in and you're going to offer a diploma of management, it's not going to happen in 5 days. If you, however, have an experienced middle manager who is coming to have their skills recognised to get a diploma of management, then in fact the training they engage with might be much shorter than otherwise expected. So the standards do actually specify what has to be considered. So you have to look at the existing knowledge, skills and experience of the learner. You have to look at the mode of delivery, and you have to look at where a full qualification isn't being delivered, the number of units and or modules that are being delivered as a proportion of that full qualification. Now, the reason that they're putting that measure in there is they're wanting you to look at the AQF, the Australian Qualifications Framework. It's been out for a few years now. I think middle of 2011 was when it was first released. It was re-released in 2013. And of course, in there we have a volume of learning as a typical measure of how long it might take a novice, your standard learner, to actually develop the knowledge and skills that they need and to engage in everything that they would need to achieve a qualification level outcome. So some very specific information saying you can't just offer a blanket approach, a one-size-fits-all approach to all of your learners. There are some people, yes, who might go through this process more quickly than others, but you have to be able to prove why your course is the length that it is. And that is a good thing. That's a very good thing. Now, there's also other information in there around making sure that we actually address the needs of the individual learners. So when we start to look at teaching and learning processes, that we have actually established what the needs of the learner are and that we put things in place to address those needs. And all the way through these standards, they talk about individual learners. So there's very, very much a focus on what does that individual who's in front of me for a learning experience need. So again, I think that is a very, very good thing. So, what do we as RTOs need to think about? And that nice blue sky is in fact what I'm suggesting that you should do. Now, I mentioned a little earlier that when you look at the concepts that sit in these standards, that there aren't new concepts in these standards, there's new levels of specification. What we tend to see happening is when these kinds of things happen, the regulators always, and they have again this time, they put out a mapping of old to new and they say this is what's different. So what we tend to see RTOs doing is going through and saying, what's different? That's what I'll add on. Okay? And so what happens is a lot of RTOs create monsters for themselves because in fact they're adding things. It's a little bit like, the hole in the dike. We stick a finger in that hole and in that hole and that hole, and all of a sudden we're spread very thinly and our stop the water from coming through is not effective. A lot of RTOs have systems in place that are very piecemeal, that aren't really focused on a quality teaching and learning process, that are in place in essence just to meet compliance requirements. This change of standards offers you the opportunity to do that same terrible thing again. It also offers you the opportunity to sit back and take a good look at what is going on in your organisation and say, from a teaching and learning perspective, from a workflow perspective, from the students' journeys perspective, how could we best address our learners' needs and meet the requirements of these new standards? Because they aren't written in a way, in exactly the same way as the last set of standards are, they aren't written in a way where it follows a logical process for the learner, where it follows a natural business process. They're not written like that. So if you break them up, then you're going to end up with a piecemeal approach. If you look at it in a holistic way and say functionally, how are we going to make these work, then in fact you've got an opportunity to do a whole lot of simplification, I think, in your organisations. You've got an opportunity to make things better, not only for you and for your staff, but also for the learners that engage with your organisations. And so I'd really encourage RTOs to take that opportunity to do that. There has even been talk amongst the regulators that in fact when it comes to auditing these standards, that in fact, and even from a reporting perspective, that we're not going to report clause by clause. that we are going to group together functionally these standards, because a lot of them are linked. So in the same way that we have looked at them and said, how are these functionally linked, you could look at them and say, how are these functionally linked and how does it fit with the workflow in our organisations? You'll get a better outcome if you do that. The other thing is, of course, the time frame is short. We're all about to go on holidays for Christmas. Some of us are having longer holidays than others. Yes. and then we've only got a few months really until we're supposed to be compliant with these standards. So it's not something that we can kind of sit back and contemplate our navels with. You know, you really do need to be starting to think about how you're going to approach this in your organisations now. And then it might even, as much as I don't want it to, it might enter into your heads over your holidays as well. I'm sure it's going to enter into mine. So the world is going to shift on its axis on the 1st of January for new RTOs and on the 1st of April for existing RTOs, as long as we get all of the legislative things in place that we need to enable that to happen. And unfortunately we are at the mercy of the government in terms of making those things happen in the time frame that they need to happen in. So as I mentioned up front, you know, information will come out from the regulators. Some of it will be in newsletters, some of it will be on their websites. And in terms of vet reform and everything else that is also involved in this, then that vet reform website, they also put out bulletins around things that are changing in that space. And the reality is everything is changing. So you're going to need to keep your ears to the ground about it. So I'd like to open the floor to questions about these new standards. It's over to you. Yes.
I have one. When you're talking about the third party, does that include the employers as well?
So the question is, when we're talking about the third party, does it include the employers as well? A third party would be anyone who is engaged providing training and assessment on your behalf or marketing on your behalf. So if the employer is involved in that way, the answer would be yes.
Just out of interest, the sort of entry requirement for the Cert 4 that is proposed in the current case of endorsement, which is that you have to hold the relevant vocational, a relevant vocational qualification. From an auditing point of view, how do you anticipate that that's going to be viewed? Is it going to be similar to the lecture of vocational currency sort of documentation?
Yep. So Julie's question was around, with the proposed entry-level qualification for the TAE, then from an auditing perspective, how would we look at those requirements, and would we look at them in the same way as the vocational competence and currency that we would look at any other qualification as now? And the answer is yes. So we would be wanting people to establish that they were competent in what they were going to deliver. In fact, they're going to have to hold that higher level qualification, and that they could actually demonstrate that they have currency in training and assessing the things that they're supposed to. So it would have the same approach as we do currently.
I'm talking about the vocational qualification.
Yes.
So would you be expecting providers of that training to keep some sort of record to indicate that they had made that evaluation before they enrolled someone?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where the audit would be
Yes.
focusing.
Yes.
I've got a question online, and it relates to which of the new standards is most challenging, particularly for small RTOs, and what you think they should focus on in the first instance. So just a simple one, but take your time.
Do I need to repeat that question? Or will I hear it? Okay. So the question is, for small RTOs, which of the standards is the most challenging, and where should they focus their efforts in the first instance? Standard 1. Standard 1 and Standard 1.
I think you said standard 1.
Yeah. Standard 1 is a monster standard. Now, the other thing that they're going to have to think about in the very short term is the implementation of the USI, because they have to be compliant with that from 1st of January. So the USI, Standard 1, and then the marketing. So the provision of information to clients, which is Standard 4 and 5. They would be the ones that I would be focusing on. But Standard 1 would definitely be the most challenging for a small RTO. Any other questions? Yes, Eva.
Well, in here it says amount of learning.
Yes,
Very big debate around that.
yes.
I just want to clarify. I remember or hearing saying, that you need to consult and establish that with industry.
Mm-hmm.
I just came across a situation, not in our RTO, but someone telling me that employers actually demanded that instead of normally they deliver the program in 5 days, they were forced to deliver it in 4 days, which that RTO actually turned that offer down because they just felt it wasn't the right thing to do. However, there are obviously very big discussions about that volume of learning. What are key indicators or key directions you could give?
Yes. Okay, so the question is around the involvement or the influence of employers in determining the amount of training that is offered. And I would come back to Standard 1.2. So Eva gave an example of an employer who, instead of training being delivered in 5 days, they were demanding that it was being delivered in a shorter time frame, and the RTO very wisely said no. So if we come back to the standards, because we always come back to them as our guide, and have a look at 1.2, and it talks about us figuring out the amount of training in regards to the learner's needs. So it's always about the learner's needs. It's about the existing knowledge, skills and experience of the learner, what the mode of delivery is, and what it stands for as a proportion of a full qualification. The employer is not mentioned anywhere in there. So when we look at industry engagement, which is certainly part of the standards, industry relevance, when it talks about industry relevance, it talks about us consulting with industry in terms of the strategies, practices and resources, not the amount of time or length of a qualification. So really we're asking industry, because they're not training and assessment experts, we're asking industry, is this content right? So if it is about using technology in the workplace, is this the right technology? If it's about filling out a workplace report, are these the kinds of reports that you fill out? It's our job as trainers and assessors to figure out the best teaching and learning approach.
Is relevance, sorry to butt in there, is relevance interchangeable then with currency? Or is that just yet another confusing sort of, is that the same thing? Is that something else I'd have to do?
Yeah. So Marion's question, is relevance the same thing as currency? And we do have a habit in our sector of using a range of terms for a very similar idea. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that relevance contributes to currency. But
Why not use the same word?
good question. The question is, why not use the same word? It's a very good question. Probably because we're not technical. It's technical writers that write the standards. Yeah. So there's no doubt that industry relevance contributes, but the concepts are different. Any other questions? I was expecting to have to wear my flak jacket for this one, so I'm quite relieved.
Maybe just another question.
Yeah.
It's sort of related to all those things, because we're
Yeah.
an enterprise RTO.
Ah, yes.
So we are the industry,
Mm-hmm.
and we're an RTO.
Yes.
And there's things in the standards such as marketing which don't really affect us, because
Mm-hmm.
we employ people, they go through the recruitment process, and as
Yep.
part of being able to do the job they have to,
Yep.
we expect them to work to a standard and to be trained to the
Yes.
standard.
Yes.
So it's, I suppose, with the blue sky, the new world, from a compliance, from an auditing perspective, is the opportunity now to maybe look at enterprise RTOs and say, we've got some very important standards here, but some are more important than others to you. Positive standard one,
Yes.
four. But there's some others that you say, let's not waste too much time on it for us, because really our participants are never really going to have a say or choice in that, because either they do that,
Well, they don't have a job.
or they don't have a job. So
Yes.
let's
Yes.
just put those ones to side, not spend time, as we've done in the past, making a policy and procedure that we just, for compliance, and we put in the drawer,
Yes.
and never ever look at.
Yes.
So the opportunity is to do that, or hope we will
Yes.
see with the new standards.
Yes. So the well,
Long-winded question.
the question. Let's see if I can paraphrase. The question is around enterprise RTOs, and there are some things that RTOs who are offering public courses do very differently to enterprise RTOs. For example, marketing. Fees is another one that's often very different for enterprise RTOs. And so do these new standards offer us the opportunity to take a look at that and say, how does that really apply and doesn't apply in enterprise RTOs as it would in any other RTO that's offering for commercial reasons? And the answer is yes and no. Because initially when these standards were first drafted, they did in fact say if you're an enterprise RTO, then these things aren't really relevant to you, and they removed that. So my thoughts around that would be picking up those things that might be relevant or not. So for example, let's say as an employee of an enterprise RTO, my employer pays for my training, and maybe as a result of that, there might be some obligation on my part to stay with the organisation for a particular period of time. And if I leave the organisation, then maybe I have to pay back the cost of the training. They're the kinds of things that we might expect you to say to your employees. So some of those things might happen in the recruitment process rather than as general marketing. When it comes to the length of time that you might actually be doing training, an example, one of the private hospitals that I saw, offered training to their staff. Now they had to do it, so they'd set up an internal system to enable them to do that, and the students could go on and have a look at the courses and see what kind of courses, or they could see the courses that they needed to do and how long those courses were and when they were, and they still had some information as learners that was important to them. Their choice of engaging with it wasn't. They knew they had to engage with it, but they still had some information around those things. So I would see that we would look at how that best fits for enterprise RTOs. And that's close to my heart because I came out of an enterprise RTO. So yeah, I think yes and no. They're not going to treat you differently, but there's certainly scope there to customise to meet your needs.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.